Okay, so to continue from last week, I want to talk about cucumber diseases and viruses, really not disorders, and touch on a couple of bacterial things, but it's mostly fungal diseases that we're going to be talking about with cucumbers. Going down the list of fungal infections, cucumbers are particularly susceptible to a lot. Damping off, rhizoctinia, botrytis, blackroot, gummy stem blight, penicillium stem rot, leaf spot. We're going to touch on all of these in this class. Now, this is the kind of document that you would want to keep as a reference. I'm not going to have you memorize every little detail. So what I would do is pay attention to the review questions for the midterm to have an idea of what you need to know for the midterm. So rather than getting lost, but let me walk you through it and then we'll discuss some common elements at the end. And hopefully if you're less concerned about all the details, you'll relax and learn a little bit. Okay, so before we get into it, sometimes people will say, well, why do I have to be able to diagnose it? We just know it's a fungal infection. And that can be true, but at the end of the day, the methods of controlling fungal infections need to be targeted to the species. So it is important that you do your best to identify the species. Now, if it's really unclear, then it's worthwhile paying the 40 or 50 bucks to mail the sample off to the University of Guelph lab or to your agricultural extension to have them diagnose it using microscopes and ELISA kits. But just below here, I've got an example, right? So I've got, Daconil, and it is effective against the two diseases like rhizoctinia and anthracnose. Whereas if we have botrytis or powdery mildew or septoria, then we actually want to go with something like pristine on this side. So uh, understanding what type of fungal infection it is you have is important. So that's why we're going through some of the common symptoms, things you'd look for when you're trying to decide what process to use to keep it under control. So the classic sort of beginner's introduction to fungal infections is damping off, right? You probably learned this in some of your courses already. I hope you have. In fact, I hope some of this is review, but my past experience, this has not always been the case. But so Pythium and Phytophthora are real common fungal infections that target roots and cause what we call damping off. And it's always starts with the root zone, right? Is it too wet? And also, if you have cold conditions, a wet root zone with cold conditions is always a recipe for disaster. So obviously, along this diagonal here on this side, we have healthy roots for a cucumber block, and on this side we have damping off, Pythium. So, and of course, the classic hallmark with diagnosing Pythium is that if you take a root, so say over here, I've got a couple of lines here that are supposed to symbolize the where the root was. So if you take these tissues and extend them along, the idea is that this part, this cylinder of root, can slide off. So if you grab a root, so down here you can see there's a hard break. If you grab this outer root and you pull, it actually sloughs off and leaves the steel behind. So in here, this is the vascular steel, the phloem and xylem bundle. So that's a quick way to diagnose Pythium infection in your crop. So can you slide off the outer cortex and leave behind the vascular steel or cambium? Uh, if you were to cut a bag open and look at the roots inside, you would see a combination of new white growth, nice white healthy roots, right? So we've got, a root here, a root here, there's a root here, there's a couple coming out, but they're surrounded by sick looking roots, and that is Pythium. So what you would do is just grab one of those roots, give it a yank, and see if you can pull it off, leaving the vascular steel behind. Then you're pretty sure at that point you have Pythium and Phytophthora. Looking at rhizoctinia, this is a key critical difference here is that it is typically above the soil line. So if you look at these seedlings that have been harvested and cleaned post-infection, you'll see that the fungal infection is around the stem at the soil level. Differing heights, but it's at the soil level. So that is one of the key differentiators for rhizoctinia. In a cucumber plant, you would look for a brown or blackening stem at the soil level. This is more common in the coir than it is in the rockwool. But effectively what happens is the fungal chokes off the vasculature and then you have sudden wilting. So sudden wilt, or onset of wilt. And then the plant just can't get water and nutrients and things go downhill pretty quickly. So it's important to keep your greenhouse clean and catch these infections quickly. It does survive on dead plant material. So it's important to clean thoroughly, not only between crops, but obviously during crops. Some farms are kind of messy. They throw everything in the ground. They wait, take their time cleaning it up, where other farms are very fastidious. You know, one way or another, Mother Nature gets you, right? So you can put the money in up front and keep it clean with pay the labor, or you can leave it and pay the money in chemical control and headaches down the road. So you know where I stand on that. Rhizoctinia does tend to be more of a summertime problem, so hot weather, and it is associated with a wet-dry cycle. So what is important is to watch your bag dry down at night. Make sure that you don't have excessive dry down at night. It's that moisture oscillation that sort of predisposes the stem to rhizoctinia. Botrytis. So botrytis is very common in greenhouses. It loves a humid environment. Of course, cucumbers are the most humid of them all. So botrytis is fairly common. And what you're looking at here is a classic example of someone who's cut something off a plant. Maybe it was a leaf that was damaged or they were lowering the vine, they cut it off, and that wound became an entry point, and the mold is growing up the petiole towards the stem. So you have to be very careful that the tools you're using are kept clean so that they're dipped and sterilized periodically so you're not spreading disease. You also want to make sure your tools are sharp so they make a clean cut. The plant's more likely to heal properly and less will heal itself up quickly and not allow an entry point for a fungal infection. So botrytis is visible as a gray fuzzy mold. So on a cucumber fruit, you see this gray fuzzy mold, that's botrytis, or on developing flowers, it's often associated with flowers. There's a gray fuzzy, that's not the best picture, but a fuzzy flower can be seen. So really critical to maintain a proper greenhouse environment. That means we've got to make sure there's no condensation forming on leaves, fruit, or flowers at the end of the day. And we need to make sure that we're not allowing the fungus to propagate by keeping our cuts clean, not leaving ragged cuts, and keeping dead tissues and whatnot cleaned up off the floor. And then, of course, you know, keeping your relative humidity below 85%, which of course you would for other things like powdery mildew we've discussed many times. Gummy stem blight. By the way, I'm not going to ask you to memorize the genus species of any of these diseases. That's something you can look up. So just, you know, don't worry about that. In the actual business, they're going to talk about it as gummy stem blight. That's what you're going to see. But it is important to understand that, you know, these things are widespread and not ignore it. So you should try to absorb this information. It's pretty easy to see here where there's like sap and exudate coming out of the stem. It's sticky. Whoops. So you can, so gummy stem blight, here's another picture to help you see. You can see the stem is actually split open, revealing the inner cortex. And there's some sort of sooty black elements. Sometimes it's black sooty mold that's growing on the sap that's leaking out, so it's a secondary infection. Be careful with that. If you're looking at the end of the fruit, so in this case it's the end of the cucumber, this is more advanced, something to help distinguish between gummy stem blight and, say, botrytis is that here it's black and smooth, right? It is not the kind of thing that grows fruiting bodies out the exterior that are nice and fuzzy. So there's no fuzzy gray mold like you would expect in botrytis. Okay, looks like Aladdin's slipper. This is cucumbers from a few years ago, before I taught this course. And these are actually cucumbers that developed gummy stem blight at the college. And you can see how they all wilted. They ended up ripping that crop out. It's a common theme. So gummy stem blight, the infections occur at pruning wounds. You've heard this before, or injured sites. Often new growth, like flowers and fruit, or sometimes leaves, but you want to look mostly at flowers and fruit, and then of course ultimately in the stem. They start as what's called a water-soaked lesion. So that would be sort of a wet, dark green looking spot. You're not going to necessarily see yellowing right away. It's just going to look water-soaked. Eventually they turn into tan-colored lesions, with sort of black structures. But hopefully you catch it before it gets too far. Some other things to help you look for, if this is on the top here is a cross section of a stem, and you're looking at the pith. So as you go further down the stem, there's an empty pith as the cambium pulls apart. And if that's sort of brown in there, that's another clue. But as you'll learn from slides coming down, that could also be fusarium. So it could be any number of things. So you have to sort of try to combine the different ideas. Or if you're trying to make a fungicide selection, then if you've narrowed it down to two, pick a fungicide that is going to be effective for the two types that you think it might be. That's sort of how you'd cover your bases. Here you can see the necrosis on the leaves. It's so hard to know, What I do try to say is that nutrient deficiencies tend to show uniformly across the leaf. So you'd expect that, the whole leading edge or the entire perimeter of the leaf is demonstrating symptoms. That would be more nutritional, where here you're seeing a lesion on one side, but not on the other. And you're seeing a big lesion on this side, but not on the other. So it's asymmetrical. That sort of is one of your clues that there may be something going on here that's not necessarily nutritional. It's not always the case, but is more often the case. So, and then of course the fruit thing here, yellowing, it could look healthy, but if you slice it open, you might see that brown region in it. So, how do you prevent it? Maintain higher ECs if possible, so we don't have too much root pressure causing split, right? So if you're looking at the stem here and there's root pressure, it causes the stem to split, and that opens up a lesion, which then allows the spores to get in and establish themselves. The other thing we can do is have elevated calcium in our fertilizer. That strengthens the walls, which again helps resist splitting. And then, of course, as always with fungal things, prevent moisture from forming on our leaves so that there's no moisture to ignite the fungal growth. So, gummy stem blight. Remember how I mentioned blossom end rot? So here's a bunch of stems, and tricky, but if you look, these growth seems to be in the center. You can trace it right to the point on each cucumber. So this is more an example of blossom end rot than it is of gummy stem. So it gets tricky to diagnose. So again, you got to look at all the conditions. But it doesn't hurt, of course, to help with calcium, to elevate it, because that's also one of the ways of avoiding gummy stem blight as well, right? So, and then of course, if you're suspicious, watch your VPDs. Make sure they're in acceptable targets so that the plant is transpiring enough. Okay, moving on. Black root. Probably simple to diagnose in the sense that the roots look black. But if you look carefully, especially younger roots with a magnifying glass, the the epidermis of the root looks splotchy. And if you looked under a microscope, you would actually see that what's going on here is the fungus is living in individual cells in blocks, like Lego blocks. So there's, a cell here, but there's nothing around it. So you get this sort of patchy growth of the fungus in the epidermis. Black root is there. This is a nice close-up right over here. You can see sort of how it's a rectangular. It's bounded by the actual plant cell. So they grow and then they burst this direction and release their spores. So what are things to look for? Slightly darker foliage, that can help. Weak growth, if your yields are down, they don't look right, you should cut the bags open and look at the roots. That's probably one of the first things you want to do when things don't seem right. If you see wilting that does not recover, so you see some couple of rows that have wilted, and you think, oh, there must be a problem with irrigation. Check. Maybe there isn't. If there isn't, then you may have another issue. Cut a few bags open. Maybe cut a lateral stem if you can find something and see what's going on. See if you have black root forming. Typically with black root, it forms at what's called the tide mark or the soil level. So if it is black root, you're looking at the stem as it goes into the bag or the rockwool block. And if you're seeing dark at the top, based on what we've talked about so far, it could be rhizoctinia or it could be black root. So you're going to open up the bag, look at some of the young roots with a microscope or a magnifying glass, and see if you can identify the epidermis, this classic structure in the root epidermis. That's why I've highlighted it. It's an important distinguishing feature. So black root rot is a soil-borne disease. That means that you got to make sure your staff are properly sanitized. Most vegetable greenhouses have shoe and foot baths that you have to walk through before you go in the greenhouse. So you don't have to take your shoes off, but what happens is you walk through a machine and it has wet brushes that brush the undersides of your shoes with a sanitizing agent, and then you move into the greenhouse. If you have poor sanitation, not only for tools, but also between crops or under your crop rows, that can contribute. But because it is soil that's most common in soil, we don't really see it in rockwool very much. We see it more in the organic producers that are growing in soil and compost mixtures. If you are reusing rockwool, it can be a risk. And if it's coir later in the crop cycle, coir starts to break down, then it's more susceptible. Cold root zones. We've mentioned this a couple of times. It is not uncommon to see a thermometer, like a cooking thermometer style thing, like a stainless steel shaft. You just pierce it into the bag. And as a grower, you go around and you would check the temperatures in the bags. Make sure they're not too cold. This is most important in the wintertime, especially around the perimeter where the sidewalls are. These are your outside is -20. Your crops are growing along here. This outside edge is going to be cold, and cold air is coming down, impacting your crop. So you have to keep an eye on those corners especially to make sure that you're not getting cold root zone temperatures, because that's where problems start to ignite. Penicillium stem rot. So yeah, that's where penicillin comes from, by the way. That's an antibiotic derived from this mold, this fungus. Penicillium oxalicum. I got some better pictures. What you're looking for here, remember penicillium is actually the classic mold you grow in your fridge with a wet piece of bread, if you remember anything like that from elementary school. this sort of blue-gray fuzzy mold, that's your classic penicillium. On cucumbers, it erupts as blue-gray fuzzy patches, often near the ends. You can also get it in the middle of a stem or along a cut-off petiole from a leaf or a sucker that was not completely removed. So it's often in soil and decaying matter. So again, if you're reusing bags, which is not uncommon in cucumber houses, if you're looking at water-soaked translucent areas along the inner nodes of your stem, then you have to be concerned that penicillium is growing in there. If you see the gray-blue mold, it's already late, right? It's already erupted. Those lesions become pale, and then your mold sort of erupts. These are on your stem, these cankers, as they're called, where the fungus sort of erupts. They usually are above and below the leaf node on the stem. It can look very similar to botrytis, botrytis especially because of the gray fuzziness. So it's tricky. You can actually if you catch scrape some of the mold into a microscope slide, if you have a little microscope at your farm, you can actually look for these, I call them palm trees. Penicillium it always looks like a big tree or a palm tree under a microscope, where all the other fungi look sort of more generic or like lollipops on a stick. But not everyone has that equipment, so. Typically, penicillium is very aggressive, which means it progresses faster and the stems actually become squishy and collapse faster. So it is a very aggressive one, so you got to be on top of it. So conditions for penicillium: high humidity, wet. This is a very common theme. Outer rows, like I mentioned, where it's cool and damp. Insufficient ventilation. Again, all generic controls for controlling fungus. Wounds. Again, you're starting to see the themes here, right? Excessive nitrogen fertilizer. I haven't talked about this one before, but it does happen. If you're pushing the crop and it's overly vegetative, right? So you're really vegetative. The tissues become soft, the leaves become very pliable, and the cell walls are weak, which makes the plant more susceptible to spores germinating and establishing themselves on the plant. So don't overdo the nitrogen. If you have too many fruit on the plant, it's kind of similar to this problem, right? You're essentially stressing the plant out, and it can't defend itself from the fungal infections because it's got these plants that are parasitic on the nutrients. Penicillium is one that is more common in rock wool as opposed to soil, which is usually the other way around, but this is one we see, probably because rock wool is quite wet. This is a challenge. There's so far penicillium, there's no resistance between cultivars, so you can't choose, different cultivars to try to prevent it from happening. You have to just deal with it. And unfortunately, it does survive between crops. So you have to make sure you sterilize the greenhouse properly in effect, before you plant a new crop. As far as what it might look like on leaves, if you see the leaves are puckered, like the surface of the leaf is bumpy, not smooth, that may be an indication that you have penicillium. It usually starts on the veins underneath the leaf, and eventually the veins become actually brown first. And on the leaves, it'll be somewhere near where it is in the stem. So if you see it on the stem, check leaves nearby for confirmation. Alternaria, this is another one. There's two kinds of alternaria, but effectively it doesn't really matter. You end up with these yellowing, blotchy spots across the entire leaf. They start at a small little points and they just get bigger and bigger. It's important to note that thrip damage can look very similar to alternaria. If you look here, you'll see there's sort of a rectangular bounded spots between the veins, patches here and here. These are actually thrip damage on cucumbers, and it can be confused between alternaria. So we have some white spots forming on our cucumbers at the college, and we weren't sure if they were thrip or not because we didn't see evidence of frass or their poop. But it is important to understand that cucumber leaves are there's not much to them if you ever look at them. They're light, the cells are massive. They're mostly water, which means that as thrip are feeding, there's not much to poop out in terms of solids. So we don't see as much frass on them. So we're gonna have to keep an eye on the thrips at the college to see if that is our issue on the older leaves. Um, we had hypothesized that there was maybe a bit too much iron and it was iron toxicity, but it's really not clear if you've seen what's going on. But generally the crop looks really good. It's just the really old leaves have these kind of exact same spots that look like alternaria. Another one is anthracnose. Always sounds scary because we think, ooh, anthrax, like deadly disease. Anthracnose is very common. I'm only talking about the fungal version in this lesson, but there is actually a bacterial, so you have to understand which one you've got. Usually bacterial, this is a raised black smooth bump on the leaf. So those would require like a copper in a fungicide. It's actually bactericidal as well to spray. So that's oftentimes anthracnose, they spray with a kind of a copper to control it. And it works both fungal or bacterial. But in the case of the cucumbers, it's most often fungal, and we see these sort of legions. And what's important to recognize is they start as pinpoints, and they kind of have concentric rings that flow outwards with a yellow margin on the edge of it. So that's how you diagnose anthracnose. Um, Again, very common. Well, it means the leaf is wet. In my experience, this is often where there's water dripping regularly. So check your greenhouse structure. Maybe there's a leaky window or even a pipe that's dripping frequently on that particular part of your crop. And that's where you'll see the anthracnose. So you can treat it all you want, but you're better off to deal with the dripping. Obviously, high relative humidity is a factor. It does show up everywhere on the fruits, the leaves, the stems. It's most predominant on the leaves, but you will see it on fruit too. I know that in the fruit, farmers in the Niagara region get anthracnose on their peaches and nectarines, apricots and plums and apples. So anthracnose is definitely a broad-reaching fungal thing, and that's important to keep in mind because sometimes these fungal infections are coming into your greenhouse from outside. Well, they are, but they might be coming from a crop really close to you, like peaches or apples and stuff like that, where botrytis, for example, blows in from grape farms. So just be aware of where you might be getting your problems from. Usually shows as a pale green water-soaked spot to begin with. Long before you start getting these brown legions, it would be like a dull green sort of soaking wet spot, like someone kind of crushed a part of the leaf. They do spread quickly, so you want to be on top of that. Powdery mildew. Now, we've spent already quite a bit of time talking about powdery mildew, so I don't want to get into it too much. But with cucumbers, it does not seem to infect the fruit. It's rare. But it will make your fruit smaller because all these hyphae growing on this leaf, and I've seen some pretty bad cucumbers in my day, that impacts the photosynthetic efficiency of that leaf. So if you're not making as many assimilates, there's not as much sugar for you to make fruit, right? So you have smaller yields and smaller fruit. It also shortens the shelf life of your fruit because it doesn't have enough sugars to give it the fuel to stay alive once it's cut off the plant. And flavor may deteriorate as well. And again, just a closer look at powdery mildew. It's usually on the surface of the leaf. It's fuzzy to look at. So I'll review this. We have talked about this lots, but I'll review it. Dry conditions cause it to sporulate. I probably will ask this on the midterm. And humid conditions cause it to increase its growth or grow hyphae or germinate the spores. So typically we do have tolerant varieties. So you can actually choose varieties or cultivars that are resistant to powdery mildew. And if you can choose it, you should do that. In the meantime, we can improve our climate to reduce the incidence of the disease by, for example, increasing air movement, but not too much. Uh, Using favorite temperatures, not having wild swings where our VPD goes outside that danger zone. Make sure the leaves don't get wet. And remember, we talked about the boundary zone, right? The idea that we need enough air movement that it will influence the surface area of the leaf. So if it's 80% relative humidity up here, it's pretty safe to say that it might be 90 at the leaf surface, right? So we have to make sure we understand that there's this boundary layer that we're trying to influence. And so what we have in our actual climate may not be what the leaf is experiencing at the epidermis in that boundary layer. Now, often confused with powdery mildew is downy mildew. And one of the best ways with cucumbers, especially, to diagnose it is if you look at the upper surface of the leaf, the fungus is bounded by these sort of cell structures of the epidermis of the leaf. So it looks rectangular. It's kind of like that black root where you see the black spots on the epidermis of the root. Downy mildew, it looks like this. It starts off as a lighter green, like you'll see there's some lighter green blocks here, 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 and then eventually they transition to yellow or darker or even full out necrotic spots. So downy mildew is something that affects all cucurbits, so not just cucumber. It's common against melon, squash, pumpkins. So if you have a pumpkin farmer that's within a couple of kilometers of your farm, there's a good chance downy mildew's in the air. So you got to be on the ball. It is a worldwide, broadly available fungus. So there's no escaping it. For the most part, it's foliar, right? So it doesn't really go after the fruit, just like powdery mildew, but you do have smaller yields in fruit size, again, because of lost leaf area, right? But unlike powdery mildew, where there's oscillations between high and low humidity, this is strictly a cold temperature, high humidity fungal infection. That's it. So it likes cool temperatures. Now, we try to keep cucumbers on the hotter side, but in the winter, especially around the perimeter of the greenhouse, again, this is something I mentioned, but it will come up, right? On the perimeter of the greenhouse, where those two exterior walls, it's cold on the outside. And that causes damp, cool conditions inside the greenhouse, in the corners especially. So watch those corners. When you're scouting your crops, always check the corners. In addition to epidermal structures to look for with downy mildew, if you flip the leaf over and look underneath, you'll see that there is a fuzzy sort of hyphal and fruiting body growth. They are usually white to purplish in color, and sometimes very dark, almost black. Its older leaves are affected primarily. Those are the key things that you would use to diagnose downy mildew. So now, as far as downy and powdery mildew, the key to identifying which one you have in your crop is to, as I jokingly say, where's the fuzz? If the fuzzy moldy growth, obviously these are not correct biological terms, but they're to help you remember. If it's underneath the leaf, it's downy. If it's both on top and under, it's powdery mildew. Okay, that's your key simple Derek way of identifying the difference between downy and powdery mildew. How can you tell if they're dead? Say you spray fungicide, it's hard to know sometimes. Well, the key thing to look at with your loop is to make sure that the hyphal or conidia or reproductive structures are laying flat, that they have matted down. That means they're dead because they've leaked out their solution and they've wilted. So if they're still standing up, proud and fuzzy, they are not dead. So be aware of that. Use your magnifying glass. If you can at the farm, maybe they have a stereo microscope, look at it carefully, make sure the fuzz is laying down, then you know it's dead. As far as preventing downy mildew, uh, again, common with all fungal things, good air circulation, making sure your leaves are dry, especially around the perimeters, not being greedy with your plants and spacing them appropriately. You know, sometimes people think more plants is more yield. Well, it depends on the time of the year and how much control you have over your climate. If you end up with fungal disease, you make a lot less yield, so it doesn't help you in the long run. Overhead irrigation is kind of irrelevant with hydroponics, but it's there. That might apply more if you're growing young cucumber seedlings for, you know, supplying greenhouses. They usually sub-irrigate. They use flood floors. They don't top irrigate. And then, of course, there is resistant cucumbers to downy mildew, just like powdery mildew. So if you can select it, do it. It doesn't mean that they're always the most desirable variety. So some farmers are forced to not grow resistant varieties, even as much as they would like to. Okay, moving on to fusarium, root and stem rot. So Fusarium solani, this is a very common one in cucumbers, in a lot of plants, to be honest. And for the most part, it lives in the central cambium of the stem. That's where we often find it when we're diagnosing it. So what the person has done here is they've sliced the stem open and peeled it back, and they've looked inside and they're seeing all sorts of light yellow-brown lesions. And that's telling them that they have fusarium in the cambium or the central pith. If your cucumbers wilt and there doesn't seem to be a good explanation, you don't see black at the soil horizon, there's no ooze coming from the stem, so it's not gummy stem, you're going to start wondering if it's fusarium. So whether you can sacrifice a plant and cut the stem open and have a look, might be worth it. If you see that brown, then you know you're off to a good start for diagnosing it. So again, here you can see there's sort of a yellow. This is an earlier stage in the cambium, kind of yellowy brown. Typically, this is a hot weather, summertime thing, when plants are stressed. That yellow stem eventually turns white. You get sort of white corkiness. Plants can kind of grow through fusarium. They'll still yield and produce, but they are choked off. They're not getting the nutrients in the water they need, so the yields drop. So if you're trying to finish a crop, it may be not the end of the world. You might be getting a couple of weeks out of it. Maybe you'll pull some more cucumbers off, and then you rip it all out. Another interesting thing about fusarium, if you cut the bag open, the roots are still firm. So the roots are not like Pythium and Phytophthora and Rhizoctinia, or mainly those first two, where the roots get soft and slough off. With Fusarium, the roots stay firm. So when you cut the bag open to look at the roots, you're going to see that the roots look relatively, you know, full of water and maybe even happy. Fusarium, one of the critical aspects for Fusarium, because it is very common, is sanitation. And commercial greenhouses all use a lot of sanitation. Staff often have uniforms, maybe even hairnets, not always, depends on the farm. It's probably more common for visitors, but staff themselves, they may go through what's called an air shower to blow off any spores and bugs. They often go through a foot bath here to wash their shoes, and they quite often have a staff uniform that they wear, and that clothing is laundered by a service so that the staff are not bringing their own clothes in. So Fusarium is one that really got that started. I mean, farms are always worried about food safety, but honestly, a lot of this cleaning that you see in farms is primarily for biosecurity. And of course, sanitizing tools is really important. Scissors and knives that are used for trimming the plants need to be dipped in sanitizer. Often at the end of the rows, they can dip them, or they put them into a bucket on a cart and pick a fresh pair. So what are some common elements in controlling fungal infections? These are the things that I'm going to want you to remember for the midterm for sure, so definitely know this list. Excellent sanitation, critical. That means not just your hands, right? I'm talking the greenhouse structure and floor, your staff, and your tools. The staff need to make sure they have clean tools that are sharp, that leave clean cuts. So we're not leaving ugly messes. This isn't particularly cucumbers. Now remember, sometimes with tomatoes, you can snap the leaf off at the abscission point and it leaves a nice clean break because that abscission layer is kind of contoured and to let the leaf off. But always in all plants, you could apply a lot of this to any crop that we've talked about so far. Clean cuts is definitely helpful. Keep your relative humidity under control. That's a critical one. For your powdery mildew, your downy mildew, your Phytophthora, your Rhizoctinia, all of them. Choose resistant varieties. Oh yeah, and I did mention this, right? Microclimates, exterior walls, corners, anything dripping, all those things, really important. Sorry, back to this one. So choosing resistant varieties when possible, absolutely. We're looking at, both virus, powder mildew, downy mildew resistance in our varieties. Consistent moisture control in the root zone, right? That means how are you irrigating? Are you letting it dry out increasingly and then giving it lots of water, or are you being subtle? So it's important to make sure that our root zones are not experiencing massive yo-yos. Plant spacing, right, and airflow, that's critical. Controlling your insects. So things like thrip and whitefly and aphids, when we talk about virus coming up next, those are critical. If you keep them under control, you reduce the spread of virus tremendously. Obviously, constantly scouting and then culling or removing plants that are suspicious immediately. Don't waste time. Just deal with it. And of course, if you start with a clean greenhouse, you're less likely to have problems. All right, I got a few slides left to talk about bacterial and viral problems with cucumbers. Bacterial wilts, rots, cucumber mosaic virus, cucumber necrosis virus, pseudo yellow virus, watermelon, there's all kinds of them. Viruses are particularly challenging. But starting with bacteria, we did talk about this with their crops class, with Erwinia, right? With succulents, especially how they like their stems. Well, they like cucumber stems too. And if you cut a stem or a petiole and you pull it apart and you see a stringy, sticky sap between the tissues, you most likely have Erwinia. So now, if it's a healthy plant, I don't know. But if the plant's showing symptoms like curled leaves, and then you cut that and pull it apart and you see this, you should be suspicious of bacteria living in the vasculature. And they produce kind of a sticky substance that fills up the vasculature and chokes it. That's why water's not flowing and the leaves are wilting. So Erwinia is transmitted through mostly cucumber beetles. Now in the summer, a lot of greenhouses try to screen their vents to keep beetles out. They can become a big problem. We don't have biologicals to go after these large, heavy insects, right? They're like tanks. So we have to use chemical controls, and we don't want to do that. So we put screens on the vents to keep them out. Similar to other infections, it starts as a dull green patch. So when you see dull green patches, good luck. I don't know. It could be anything. If you see wilting, then you need to consider it is Erwinia. So remember what I said, cut that petiole, pull it apart, see if it's got stringy, sticky sap. Then you have an Erwinia problem. It does move very quickly, and the entire plant will wilt very quickly, including fruit, because the entire vasculature is choked up with that gummy sap. Erwinia is a tricky one, but cleanliness and identification. Moving on to viruses, cucumber mosaic virus. The key here, viruses are very difficult to diagnose. You almost always have to use Agdia antibody strips, which you can buy, and take a leaf sample, crush it into a tube, add the solutions, dip your Agdia kit, and then identify it. I'm pretty sure you talked about this in one of your other courses, so I'm not going to repeat that. But aphids are big vectors for CMV, and you definitely got to manage your weeds because aphids don't really like cucumbers that much, but they love weeds. So in greenhouses, sometimes around the, again, the exterior of the greenhouse, you might get grass tufts growing. Those have to be removed. You need a weed-free barrier around the perimeter of your greenhouse to keep aphids at bay. But with the CMV, you want to look for this sort of light green sort of mosaic. It looks almost, well, yeah, it says mosaic, but this is what it looks like a convoluted structure of mottled light green, almost like a fractal. That is indicative of CMV virus. Some more pictures. I can see how you might think it was a nutrient deficiency, but the leaf is kind of mottled here. That helps tell you that something else is going on. And this is showing up more around the veins, where usually we're looking at intervenal chlorosis with nutrition. Although there are some micronutrient deficiencies like zinc, which show up in the veins. So again, you want those Agdia kits to identify if it's a virus or not. Then cucumber necrosis virus, this is a tough one. These things are really brutal because this looks a lot like anthracnose. So how do you know? How do you know? It's tough. So you can use those kits, Agdia kits. I'll put a link in this week's folder for you to find so you can read up on them. And if it comes out negative for any virus, then you know it's probably anthracnose. Pseudo yellow virus. This is a tough one because it looks just like a nutrient deficiency, except for the simple fact that on older leaves typically is where it presents. And when you see intervenal chlorosis like this, it's always on the young leaves because we're dealing with iron. If it was on the old leaf in yellow, we would assume it was nitrogen. But remember, nitrogen is yellow evenly across the whole leaf. The veins would be yellow as well. So that sort of helps you identify pseudo-yellow virus. It is vectored by whitefly, so you definitely got to keep on top of whitefly and make sure it's not in your greenhouse. Lots of incarcia. So general comments with viruses, we want to control weeds because that controls our vectors. And on top of that, then we're going to control our aphids and our whitefly and our thrip. And as all of these things, sanitation you can see is obviously huge. Whether it's fungal, viral, bacteria, sanitation is absolutely critical. That's why well-run greenhouses look like a hospital. Polished concrete walks, white epoxy structures, sanitation stations, you name it. If a plant is suspected, remove it. There's millions of plants in the greenhouse. You're not going to miss one. Not the end of the world. And by the way, when you remove a plant, you put it into a garbage bag at that location, seal the bag, and then take it out. You don't drag the sick plant through the entire greenhouse hanging behind you as you walk towards the dumpster in the parking lot. That's not going to help you, is it? Obviously, clean clothing and tools, disinfection, and of course, disinfecting, recirculating nutrient solutions. Now, what's the one that impacts viruses? Well, we know that ozone and UV will kill viruses. Not many are very effective at viruses after that. Bromine, chlorine maybe, but you can't use chlorine with cucumbers. So you're looking at mostly ozone and UV. So you definitely got to keep things clean. All right, that brings us to the end of this. I'll put the Agdia link in this week's folder, and see you at the greenhouse. Bye.